A bit less than 2,000 years ago in northwestern Europe, this time of year was called Longatinos, which meant long day for obvious reasons. And this was in the Proto-Germanic language. An offshoot of Proto-Germanic speaking people moved to Britain and became the Anglo-Saxons, and because of ordinary process of sound change, the word Longatinos became Lencten. By this point, in all likelihood, nobody would really think of it as meaning long day anymore, it just meant spring. Good evening. This was supposed to be the afternoon of the Archaeology Society formal at uni, but unfortunately an unnamed spanner has been thrown in the works of that, so I decided to have a little formal in my back garden instead. It's not quite the same, but there we are. And I'm also going to have a little talk with you today about a seasonal talk about spring, about Lencten in Anglo-Saxon society. Now, like any society, the Anglo-Saxons would have seen the year through their own cultural lens. They would have seen seasons and months in terms of what they had to do during those months and what happened during those months and what they saw around them, just like we do, although obviously for them those things would have been slightly different. A common practical theme running throughout the Anglo-Saxon period would have been the agricultural year and the different activities associated with springtime in terms of agriculture, and these would have been things like calving and lambing, generally livestock being born en masse. So cows, for one thing, cows would have had to have been milked a lot more, and in fact, certain writers like Bede mention a month which they call Thri Milka Monath, which means 3 milk month, which has been taken to suggest that cows were being milked 3 times a day, or that was common practice, although obviously common practice would have differed from place to place. In terms of vocabulary, a baby koe was called a chauf. A baby sharp was called a lamb, with the b sound pronounced. Now, chauf is a bit strange because it has this palatalization of the k sound to ch, chauf instead of calf. This is the West Saxon, the sort of textbook Old English pronunciation. A more northerly pronunciation would be calf, without that palatalization and with a monophthong instead of a diphthong. And presumably this is what's gone on to become the modern word calf. But then even that represents a fairly modern way of looking at things. Anglo-Saxons would have had, are recorded to have had a very wide variety of vocabulary identifying the sex of the animal, the stage the animal was at in its life cycle. So a male pig, a boar, would be called an ovor. A male pig that had been castrated would be called a barg. A young sow would be called a gilte. So you'd have many words for each different animal, each denoting a certain sex at a certain stage in its life cycle. And everyone would have been familiar with this vocabulary in a way that modern people are not, or that modern non-agricultural people are not. Many of these words still exist in agricultural communities and in regional dialects, but that would have been something people were much more aware of at that point in history. Another thing spring meant was the appearance of new wild animals, so new baby fuglas in nest, new wild airu, which people could take and eat, and also the appearance of new wild plants which could be used medicinally and also in food, and a sort of variety of food in general actually would appear. You'd have blåman and blostmas, and you'd also have ovet, which is the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English cognate of the German word obst, meaning fruit. The appearance of new flowers would mean that beon would start to become more active and more numerous, and beekeeping was a very common thing in the Anglo-Saxon period. An awful lot of Anglo-Saxon farms engaged in beekeeping, and bees were considered to be very important things. So the word beo forms the first part of the name Beowulf, which actually meant bee wolf. In spiritual terms, we don't really know much about what spring would have meant to migration era Anglo-Saxons, so pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons. But we know there was a figure called Eostre, who was celebrated during the springtime, and that celebration. Sorry, and that celebration persists even today in the form of Easter, although obviously halfway through the Anglo-Saxon period, or earlier in the Anglo-Saxon period, it took on Christian connotations, and now it's associated with Jesus on the cross and all of that. But at the time, it was originally a pre-Christian festival. We don't know much about the festival, and we don't know much about the figure of Eostre. She might have been a sort of goddess associated with, judging by the time of year, maybe fertility or new life or something like that. But that's just a guess based on the fact that it's in the springtime. We really don't know much about that. The Anglo-Saxon word for spring, Lencten, which I mentioned earlier, actually survives as a sort of Easter-related concept today in the word Lent, which is the continuation of that word. The celebration of Easter post-Christianization was very elaborate in sort of monastic contexts. Monks carried out a series of rituals that represented Christ's experience of the first Easter. So they'd reenact the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, the story of Jesus washing the feet of the poor. They'd make charitable donations to people that needed them, and they would represent the crucifixion with a dramatic ceremony involving blowing out candles until they were left in total darkness. This is from a 10th century text called the Regularis Concordia. Is that right? Regularis Concordia, yeah. So this only represents the way things were done at that very late stage of the Anglo-Saxon period. You might even call that borderline Anglo-Norman, but it's a prescriptive text. It's laying down recommendations for how monks ought to behave. So in all likelihood, it represents a pretty big geographical area. What people were doing at home is unfortunately less clear. It seems fairly likely that Brittonic customs involving a fire to mark the start of summer might have carried on at least in certain places, because you still find local variations of this in the 19th century. The idea of fasting in late winter and early spring has also become connected with Christian ideas, but it coincides with this time of year when relatively little food would have been available anyway. So in late spring and summer you have an abundance of wild foods, lambs, fruit. In autumn you have a whole different variety of fruits, and you'd also slaughter a load of animals to save having to fodder them, having to feed them over winter, because you used to keep a store of hay which you'd feed cattle over winter when they couldn't get decent grazing. But in autumn you'd probably have more cattle than your hay could sustain, so rather than having a load of them sort of thin, scrawny cattle, you'd kill some of them in autumn while they were fat and preserve the meat. So these autumnal foods would last you through early winter, and autumn was also obviously the time you'd be harvesting crops. So late winter and early spring is really the time you'd be struggling most in terms of food. That doesn't mean to say everyone would have been sort of scraping by. It just means if there was a particularly bad year, you'd feel the effects very obviously in this late winter, early spring period, and that's when you'd have to be sort of portioning out food, probably not eating as much as you'd like. So this might be connected to the idea of fasting at Lent or giving things up. Maybe the Christian concept comes from a similar place of reasoning. I don't really know how seasonality worked in the Middle East back then. Either way, next week I'll be doing, not next week, next time I upload a video, I'll be doing a slightly more complicated video where I'll explain an interesting concept in reconstructing Proto-Indo-European, the common ancestor of most modern European languages. I just turned the camera off and the fucking robin's back. Well, thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.